On the 27th of October 2025, something historic happened. The Renters' Rights Act received royal assent and became law. After years of campaigning, parliamentary battles, and broken promises from previous governments, tenant groups across England erupted in celebration. The housing minister called it the most significant transformation of the rental market in almost 40 years. Shelter, Generation Rent, and Citizens Advice hailed it as a generational upgrade. Finally, after decades of powerlessness, renters were getting the protection they deserved. Section 21 no-fault evictions gone. Discrimination against families and benefit recipients banned. The right to challenge unfair rent increases enshrined in law. It was meant to be the beginning of a new era, a rebalancing of power between landlord and tenant. But here's what nobody's telling you. While politicians take their victory laps and charities pop the champagne, landlords across the country are making very different calculations. And the consequences of those calculations are already reshaping the rental market in ways that could leave millions worse off than before. Because you can legislate all you want, but when the people providing the housing decide they've had enough, all the rights in the world won't find you somewhere to live. So what exactly did you get? On paper, the Renters' Rights Act looks transformative. Section 21 evictions, the notorious no-fault notices that allowed landlords to turf out tenants for any reason or no reason at all, are finally abolished. From now on, landlords can only evict if they've got a proper legal ground, things like rent arrears, antisocial behavior, or genuine need to sell the property. Your tenancy becomes a rolling periodic contract instead of a fixed term, which means you're not trapped into yearly renewals at the landlord's mercy. If you've got children or receive universal credit, landlords can no longer discriminate against you. That's now illegal, backed up with fines of up to $7,000 for anyone caught breaking the rules. Rent increases are limited to once per year, with 2 months' notice required, and if you think the increase is taking the mick, you can challenge it at a tribunal. You've got the right to request a pet, and landlords have to have a proper reason to say no, not just a blanket ban, because they can't be bothered. A new landlord database will finally bring transparency to the sector, and a private rented sector ombudsman will handle disputes without needing to drag everything through the courts. Properties will have to meet the Decent Homes Standard, and a WAB's law will force landlords to fix hazards like damp and mold within set timeframes. If they breach the rules, they're looking at fines up to £40,000 for serious offences, and tenants can claim back up to 24 months of rent through rent repayment orders. It's comprehensive, it's ambitious, and it's absolutely useless if you can't find anywhere to rent. Because here's the problem nobody wants to talk about. The Act became law in October 2025, but it won't actually come into force until sometime in 2026. The government's being deliberately vague about when. They keep saying landlords need an adjustment period to prepare for the changes, that they'll provide sufficient notice before implementation. Spring 2026 is the earliest prediction, possibly summer, maybe later. The housing minister promised clarity as soon as possible, but as of now, there's no firm date, which means there's a gap, a window between the law existing and the law meaning anything. And in that window, landlords are moving fast. Ministry of Justice figures show that Section 21 notices filed in 2024 hit the highest level in 8 years. 32,287 claims. Landlords racing to secure possession of their properties before the new rules kick in and they lose that power forever. Nearly 3,000 households were forced out through no-fault evictions in the last quarter of 2024 alone. That's not speculation about what might happen when the law changes. That's what's happening right now, while everyone's celebrating the victory. Thousands of tenants being pushed out before they ever get a chance to benefit from their new rights. But the evictions are only part of the story. The bigger problem is what's happening to the landlords themselves. Research from Spare Room shows that 67% of landlords plan to either leave the rental sector altogether, reduce their property portfolios, or switch to short-term holiday lets in 2025. 2/3 of the entire landlord population. Only 4.5% are planning to expand. A survey from the National Residential Landlords Association reveals that 88% of landlords have no confidence whatsoever in today's private rental sector. That figure rises to 90% in London. When asked what's driving them out, 88% cited the Renters' Rights Act itself as their top concern, followed by the end of Section 21 at 75% and reduced profitability at 70%. These aren't fringe operators or rogue landlords. These are ordinary people who've been letting out properties for years, and they've decided the new regulatory environment isn't worth the hassle. Data from 20CI shows that in the first quarter of 2025, 15.6% of all new property instructions were previously rented homes, up sharply from 9.8% the year before. That's over 70,000 former rental properties hitting the sales market in just 3 months. And here's the kicker. Of those sold in late 2024, only 2.9% were bought by other landlords and put back on the rental market. The rest? Gone. Converted to owner-occupied homes or snapped up by people who'll never rent them out. Industry estimates suggest around 18,000 properties have either exited or are about to exit the rental market since late 2024. 18,000 homes vanished from the available supply, while the government celebrates giving renters more rights. And that's the fundamental problem with the Renters' Rights Act. It gives you rights, but it doesn't give you homes. Every landlord who sells up and leaves is one less property available to rent. Doesn't matter how strong your protections are if there's nothing to rent in the first place. The private rental sector now houses nearly 20% of households in England. That's around 11 million people, depending on landlords to provide their accommodation. And the sector's shrinking. Goodlord's State of the Lettings Industry report found that 30% of landlords have either sold a rental property or put one on the market in the past year. Another 17.4% are considering reducing their portfolios in the coming year. More than half of letting agents reported a significant decrease in available properties. The supply crisis was already brutal. 15 households competing for every rental home, according to Zoopla. Rents climbing at 5.8% annually in England, 7.8% in Wales. In London, average rents reached £2,227 per month, an 11% rise in just 1 year. And that's before the full weight of the landlord exodus hits the market. The government keeps promising to build 1.5 million homes by 2029, with a focus on social housing to ease pressure on private rentals. Brilliant. Except it's 2025 now, that's 4 years away. And the landlords aren't waiting 4 years, they're selling today. Meanwhile, over 1.2 million private renters in England are already struggling to keep up with rent payments. Food bank use among renters rose 30% in 2024, and many of those using them are fully employed professionals. Teachers, nurses, civil servants, people working full-time who still can't afford to eat properly. The Renters' Rights Act doesn't address any of that. No rent controls, no immediate supply solutions. Just a promise that eventually, maybe, if everything goes to plan, there'll be enough housing. Eventually. But even if you manage to find a property, even if you've got your new legal protections, there's another massive problem waiting. The enforcement system is broken before it's even started. The Act relies heavily on the first-tier tribunal to handle rent increase challenges. Tenants can now dispute any rise they think is above market rates, and the tribunal will review the evidence and make a binding decision. Sounds fair, except the tribunal is already chronically underfunded and understaffed. Legal experts are warning that it simply doesn't have the capacity to handle the anticipated surge in cases. The Law Society has explicitly stated that the courts aren't ready for the increased workload the Act will create. And here's where it gets worse. The government has no plans to backdate rent increases if they rule in favor of the landlord, which means if you challenge a rent rise and it takes 6 months to get a hearing, you pay the old rent for those 6 months regardless of the outcome. That creates a massive incentive for tenants to challenge every single increase, even frivolous ones, because there's no downside. Free money for half a year while the case drags through the system. Some peers in the House of Lords suggested filtering challenges through the Valuation Office Agency first to weed out unfounded cases, but the government rejected it, citing concerns about resources and delays. So instead, the tribunal will be flooded with cases it can't handle, creating delays that could stretch for months or even years. Chris Norris from the NRLA described it as a potential system of de facto rent controls through delay alone. And it's not just rent challenges. The entire possession process is about to get exponentially more complicated. Without Section 21, every eviction now has to go through Section 8, which requires proving specific grounds like rent arrears or antisocial behavior. But here's the catch. For rent arrears, the tenant must owe at least 3 months' rent, both at the time of the notice and at the hearing. Tenants can avoid eviction by making partial payments just before the court date, which means even legitimate cases where landlords have proper grounds could drag on for months. And the courts are already backlogged. County court bailiff delays in London alone are running months behind. The average delay for possession hearings is climbing, and that's before the new system kicks in. Landlords looking at this situation are doing the maths. Longer waits to regain possession, higher legal costs, more professional tenants gaming the system. Many are deciding it's simply not worth the risk anymore. And then there's what happens to the landlords who stay. Because those compliance costs don't just disappear, they get passed straight down to tenants in the form of higher rents. The energy performance certificate requirements are tightening. From 2028, all rental properties must meet a minimum EPC rating of C. For many older properties, that means 10 to 25 grand per unit in upgrades. Insulation, new windows, updated heating systems. Post-Grenfell fire safety regulations have forced building-wide cladding upgrades, costing landlords tens of thousands. The Decent Homes Standard will require properties to meet minimum quality thresholds, which means more maintenance, more inspections, more paperwork. Registration with the new landlord database will come with fees. Membership in the private rented sector ombudsman will be mandatory with annual costs. Legal fees for navigating the new Section 8 possession process will be higher than the old Section 21 system. Insurance premiums are rising as insurers price in the increased regulatory risk. Mortgage costs have already exploded. Buy-to-let rates that were under 2% a few years ago are now hovering between 5.5% and 6.5%. For many landlords, rental income no longer covers the mortgage payment. They're subsidizing tenants out of their own pockets, which is precisely why so many are selling. The ones who stay, the professional landlords with multiple properties and deep pockets, they'll absorb these costs and pass them along. Rents will keep climbing because the underlying economics haven't changed. If anything, they've got worse. And here's the truly perverse outcome. Some landlords are already gaming the new system. Knowing that tenants can challenge rent increases and that challenges won't be backdated, they're advertising properties at inflated prices from the start. 20% of landlords surveyed said they plan to advertise higher rents to leave room for downward negotiation, essentially building in a hedge against tenant gazundering, which means asking rents will spike across the board, distorting market metrics and making it look like rents are rising even faster than they actually are. The ban on rental bidding wars, meant to stop tenants competing against each other, could backfire spectacularly. If landlords can't accept offers above the asking price, they'll simply set the asking price higher to begin with. So here's where we actually are. You've got new rights, properly transformative ones, on paper. But those rights won't be enforced for months, possibly longer, and in that gap, landlords are either evicting tenants or selling properties entirely. 2/3 of landlords are planning to leave or reduce their involvement, which means the supply of rental homes is collapsing at exactly the moment demand is surging. Rents are still climbing well above inflation and wage growth, hitting 5.8 to 8.7% annually depending on where you live. The enforcement system, the tribunals and courts meant to uphold your new protections, is already overwhelmed and underfunded before a single case hits their desks. There are no rent controls in the Act, nothing to stop prices spiraling further as supply tightens. The government promises millions of new homes, but those are years away, and landlords are leaving today. The ones who remain will pass compliance costs straight to you in higher rents. And some are already manipulating asking prices to game the new challenge system. Meanwhile, over 1 million renters are in arrears. Food bank use is soaring, and councils are spending record amounts on temporary accommodation because there's nowhere for people to go. The Renters' Rights Act is supposed to fix a broken rental market. Instead, it might be accelerating its collapse. Because you can't legislate supply into existence. You can't tribunal your way into a home that doesn't exist. and you can't regulate a market that's vanishing before your eyes. The Act gives tenants power on paper, but power without housing is just paperwork. And right now, as landlords file Section 21 notices at record rates and properties disappear from the rental market by the thousands, that's all most renters have. A law that promises security in a market that's providing less of it every single day. The rights are real. The protections matter. But if there's nowhere to rent, none of it helps. And that's the uncomfortable truth nobody wants to say out loud. You just got historic new rights, and they might not save you.